This is the MicroCART GUI walkthrough for the Senior Design Team of May 23, Team 45. So starting off with just kind of a brief overview of the block diagram of the ground station and how the GUI communicates with the backend. So there's a TCP socket, and it only does one command at any given time. And then an alternative to using the GUI would be using the command line interface, which the user types commands and responses in the command line. But the GUI is a lot more visual and a lot easier to use than using that command line interface. And we'll be focusing on the GUI portion of this block diagram today. So how to use the GUI. Once you have launched the GUI in the ground system, you should have the GUI pop up in the ground station in the terminal. And so this is what it looks like when it initially pops up without any of the graphs or anything in there right away. And the first step that you need to do is you need to navigate to the Backend tab and make sure the text box says ./backend, and then you need to click connect, and that is how you're able to connect to your drone. And to be able to get this slide to pop up in the first place, what you need to do is run MicroCART and the radio or the drone number from the Excel sheet on to get the GUI to pop up. And for getting and setting parameters, this lets you set and view the parameters to the CrazyFly. And after connecting to the backend, you navigate to the parameter tab. At the top half lets you view the parameter values of the CrazyFly, while the bottom half lets you set those same parameters. You have to select the group that the parameter is part of, and then you can select the specific parameter in that group. So for example, certain groups have their own parameters to them, and so you can set the group and then click the entry of that, and then you're able to click get param and view kind of what you just set or what it already is originally, and then you're also able to set it here, and so you can set it to the specific group and specific value, and then you click set param, and then you can check it with the get param to make sure that you got what you were intending to get. And for sending set points to the drone, you first navigate to the control tab and you make sure that the manual set point is selected. Once you do this, you can enter a desired pitch, roll, and yaw, and then slide the thrust boxes back and forth. You can then choose if you want to send a rate or an angle set point, and then click apply to send it. And clicking stop will send a stop set point. All inputs would be 0 to the drone at that point. Then we have graphing the log variables. So if you would want to go add new logging variables, you can see the section, we'll talk about that next. But with the CrazyFly connected, you navigate to this control tab that's selected at the top there. And in the sidebar, you can specify up to 5 variables that you want to log, and they're all in different colors. So you can choose that first blue one to be maybe the yaw set point or etc. And you can just graph those and be able to actually truly visualize what the data that you're getting looks like. And if you want to add new log variables, the CrazyFly uses what we call log blocks to define what variables are logged and sent to the ground station. A log block specifies what values to send and what rate. Log blocks can be paused and resumed after initial setup, and note that the CrazyFly communication has limited bandwidth, so only enable around 10 logging variables at a time. And to be able to add new logging variables, first you need to navigate to the log blocks tab, and the list is on the left, and it shows all of the available logging variables from the CrazyFly firmware. And to view and modify with the variables sent, you click Open Logging Setup File, and that will open up the file on the left here. And the logging blocks have a defined format that must be followed. A block definition starts with start block. The next line in the logging block integer ID, it must be unique to other logging blocks defined. The next line is the name of the logging block, and this can be any string that you'd like. The next line is an integer defining the rate of the logging block. A higher number pushes more data to the ground station, but note that too high of a data rate can overload the graphing visualization and cause the GUI to slow down. So safe values are usually below 100. The following lines define the variables that are in the logging block. These are defined by the firmware and can be viewed in a large list mentioned above. Any numbers of variables can be in the log block, and they do not have to be from the same logging group. A log block definition ends with end block in all capital letters. Any lines that are outside of the block definition are ignored. After you are done adding your log block, you can save and close the logging block file. You click Refresh Logs to send the new definition to the file, and then the dropdown on the right now shows your new logging block and will be active. If needed, you can increase the available bandwidth during logging and pause all other log blocks, selecting your new one from the dropdown and resuming it. Now getting into a little bit about the gamepad control. So be sure to pass the USB gamepad to the VM by clicking the USB symbol at the bottom right window and selecting the gamepad. Once you've done this, you can navigate to the gamepad tab, and the provided gamepad should be configured already. If not, you can click around to configure the tab, then move the joystick to the maximum and minimum values to be able to successfully calibrate it. Once you're done with this, you can navigate to the Control tab and select the Gamepad Control button after you've plugged in your controller. The ground station will immediately start sending set points to the Crazy Fly. So now we have a little bit about how to use the GUI and how to go back and forth with it. We're going to do a brief Qt GUI crash course. So it's pretty intuitive, so you can see all of the different layouts and spacers and buttons, different item views on the left, and you can actually click and drag those onto the actual GUI that you want to use. So for example, that apply button, we were able to click and drag that, and then you can also interact with each widget and set the properties. And each widget can have different properties to it, and then in this part you're also able to add certain events to it. For example, if you want to have an on-click event to the apply button, you're able to kind of play with that around here and work with that front end really easily to be able to click and drag things around. And then it also shows you in the bottom right corner kind of the vertical stretch and kind of the location and the sizing policies of what those actual buttons and everything looks like. If you don't want to use Qt, you can use HTML. All that code is generated in HTML. This is not as intuitive, and it's a little harder to follow. You have to manually kind of set everything. So you have your main class of your Qt window, and you have to make sure everything's enabled, and have to set kind of the size policy. You have to do that all manually here, so it's a lot easier to just be able to use the Qt on the previous slide. And then now diving into the front end and back end interaction, we're going to talk about one specific example, and then this specific example really applies to everywhere else in the code. So just starting with that get param button. So once you click that get param button, there's an on-click event, and this is what that on-click event looks like. So it goes through and it clears out the values, and it takes the group and entry that are in that box, and it adds those together, and it as a key, and it sends those to the get param value. So here's where we call the get param value. To do this, we take advantage of signals and slots functions to make asynchronous calls to the other function. And in this case, when we emit the get param signal from the main window.c file to the crazyfly worker class, the crazyfly worker will receive the signal and perform the task accordingly. Next, we move to the front end to back end interaction, the worker class, specifically the crazyfly worker and the get param value function, and we pass in the parameter param name. And from here, the crazyfly worker will send it to the backend through a TCP connection, which is visualized here in the worker class, and then the data is then admitted, as you can see on the last line there, and the task is then complete. And thank you, that'll conclude, and this is the link to the repo if you want to look about it more, and there's the wiki page on there as well. That's easy to follow.